Hey everybody, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Dunns. Today we're picking up in a brand new month with a brand new book. We're in Luke chapter number 5. Now, a couple of things you need to know about Luke chapter number 5. The reason why we're starting here is because we read the initial chapters of the book of Luke at Christmas. And we're choosing to pick up here because this is the chapter that kind of begins the public phase of Jesus' ministry. Now, we also discussed this yesterday at church. And so the whole story of the paralytic man coming down through the roof, I'm gonna just say, listen, if you are interested in that part of the story, please just refer back to the sermon from yesterday, and we spent a good bit of time there.
I'll put a link in our description.
There you go. She'll put a link. Now, also, we're going to pick the boys up from their grandparents tomorrow because they spend the little 4th of July weekend there, so you won't have to just deal with us. They'll be back, and the true wisdom will be back in the videos. All right, so let's look in chapter number 5. This is where Jesus' ministry kicks off. And what's interesting is that there's some of the same language used in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. For instance, in verse number 3, it says, "And then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and he taught the multitudes from the boat." You're going to see this same language of Jesus sitting down and teaching the multitudes in like Matthew chapter number 5 when he sits down on the mountain to teach the Sermon on the Mount. This is interesting because in Jesus' day, when a rabbi wanted to communicate something to people, he would sit down. And as he sat down, it indicated he's got something pretty important to say. As a matter of fact, this concept is still out there in the world today. That's why when you go to a university, that there's a professor in a department who's the head of the department, and they call him the chair or the chairman of a department. So this kind of concept still exists around. What I like about this is that the whole story begins with, this is a rapid succession chapter just dealing with people. Let me give you a for instance. So in the very first section, Jesus is calling his disciples, but he does it by taking the initial disciples out into the mission field that they're already used to. So the first 4 guys he calls are fishermen. So guess what he does with them first? He takes them fishing. And he shows them that he is calling them to more than what they've ever been able to do on their own. And the way he does that is he takes them out there and he tells them to throw their nets on the other side of the boat. Now, they've tried this, but when they go out there, they say, "At your word, we will do this." I want you to know, by the time they start pulling in these fish, they're having to get help because their nets are tearing. And remember, these nets were made for professional work, so their breaking indicates that this was a huge, massive catch, and this was way outside the ordinary of what they were normally doing. Jesus is showing them in the world that they're already living in. He's showing them a glimpse of the kind of world that he offers them. And so he's going to do this with a bunch of people in this chapter, but he starts with the guys that he's going to keep with him closest, and he's going to kind of invest most of his time into. Jen, what was your takeaway?
Well, first of all, we're with Jesus, y'all. That's pretty exciting to me, especially coming out of the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of everything that we've been reading. Coming out of Nehemiah, it's a perfect segue. And just check out today's sermon. It was really good. As we read through this chapter today, I look at all the people, and that's what we're going to see a lot of. People coming in contact with Jesus, and they have to decide who they say he is to them. And so we see a few different people. We see people in need, people who need something from him, whether they need healing. And so they come to Jesus with a need, and then they decide what they're going to do with Jesus. We see people who get to witness his miracles and watch what he does, and they think that's amazing, but it doesn't really affect their lives. Today, PreacherHubs had a quote that I wrote down in my Bible. It says, "Being amazed by Jesus is not the same as belonging to Jesus." As someone who loves music and loves worship, I understand the idea of being in awe of Jesus and being impacted emotionally by who he is, but does that further impact me into my discipline? Does that further impact my life in how I let God lead me? Does that affect how I live? Do I allow God to awe me, or do I allow God to be the Lord of my life? And then finally, we see disciples. We see people who meet Jesus and even forsake their income and every life as they knew it so that they could follow Jesus, so that they could follow him. And so as we read this, as we start out with the gospel, I think that's a really good place to assess your own life and to think about how you live. And do you see yourself in any of these people? Are you someone who goes to Jesus needing something? Maybe you go to him only in time of need. Maybe you turn to him with your prayer list and you run to him for those needs and you don't walk with him daily. Maybe you're someone who goes to church on Sunday mornings and you witness really good worship and you witness people around you that are excited and love the Lord, and you are filled with good feelings for Jesus, but it doesn't impact the way you live. Or maybe you are a true follower of Christ. Maybe you are a disciple. Maybe you know Jesus in a way that it impacts your daily life all day long, every day. And so as we start out this gospel, I think that's a perfect place to assess your own heart and your own life and see, who do you say Jesus is? How do you live? Maybe not so much with your mouth, but how do you live that out?
That's right. I thought it might be helpful if we just kind of went through chapter 5 just real quick, gave you a couple of quick bullet points of just the big view of chapter number 5. So Jesus calls his disciples. First of all, he's dealing with 4 fishermen, and they get this great catch. And then I want you to look in verse number 8. Here's what it says. It says, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." And so Jesus' power and his presence exposed something in Simon's heart. He just caught a bunch of fish, and guess what? He's a fisherman. This should have made him excited, but what it's doing is just being in the presence of Jesus exposes something in his heart. One of our early church leaders said it like this: man never attains to a true knowledge of himself until he has first contemplated the face of God and come down after such contemplation to then look inside of himself. Well, the next person that Jesus deals with is a leper. And the way Jesus heals this leper is that he touches the leper. And it says this, he says, behold, he was in a certain city, and behold, a man was full of leprosy. That literally means it was all over his body. The one thing you didn't do was get close to a leper.
They didn't even walk on the same road.
No, they didn't. Yeah, they moved on the other side of the road. And yet Jesus here put his hand and touched the guy.
I love that.
Now, in the law, it said that if you touched a leper, the leprosy basically made you unclean. But Jesus is the king of the upside down kingdom. And so when you read this, Jesus, instead of the leprosy infecting him and making him unclean, Jesus' power infects the leper and the leper becomes clean. Jesus is different than anybody else in this whole kingdom. The next is the story of the paralytic man dropped through the ceiling. The next is the story of Matthew the tax collector. And this is my favorite about this, because all of these other stories are great. Like we go, yay for the fisherman and yay for the leper and yay for the paralytic. And then the next person Jesus calls is a tax collector named Matthew. They hated the tax collector, not just because he took their money, which, by the way, he was probably taking their money unfairly, which is how they got so rich. They hated him because he was Jewish, but he was working for the Roman government and he was abusing his own people. He was a sellout. That's why nobody liked the tax collectors. And Jesus chose him to be a disciple. So Jesus had already called fishermen, but now he's calling somebody that everybody universally goes, what? Hold on. Who? And what it reminds me is that Jesus is never ashamed of his followers. He isn't ashamed of Peter, James, and John. He's not ashamed of Matthew here. And if he's not ashamed of them, he's not ashamed of us. This is the Jesus who is not a far off God who says we got to work ourselves up to knowing him. This is the Jesus who comes to us where we are and says, hey, you're mine. Come here. I want you to keep reading and notice this is the story, a collection of stories of people meeting God because God came to meet people. And by the way, as you pick up his word every day, he wants to meet with you. Have a great day. Keep reading. We'll see you tomorrow.
Check out yesterday's sermon.
If you want to. All right. Bye.